Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Seth Monahan, and this is the second of my 2 videos on sequences that fall by third. Last time we learned about the Pachelbel D3, now it's time for what I call the tonicizing D3. We're going to start with an inauspicious little passage from Mozart, a bit of connecting material that takes us from tonic to dominant. It has 2 parts. In the first, the bass line walks down the entire scale from tonic to scale degree 2. It then turns itself around and walks back up to scale degree 5. Now there's nothing special about the second part, it just goes from predominant to dominant. Our concern is with the first part, which I'm going to describe as mostly sequential, because the bass, rhythm, and harmony are all actually sequential. It's only the top voice that breaks the pattern in a few spots. Now, it's not hard to see that the sequence descends by thirds, and it shares a bunch of features with the Pachelbel archetype. Its odd-numbered chords, the chords on the downbeats, are all root position triads, falling by thirds. And as we've already seen, the bass descends by step just like the most popular version of the Pachelbel. So we wouldn't actually have to change much to turn this D3 sequence into an authentic Pachelbel. And yet, the Pachelbel version, which only changes the 3 shortest chords, sounds totally different, and not necessarily in a good way. The recomposed version feels kind of flat, less animated than Mozart's original. To figure out why this is, let's put the actual score back on screen and look at those 3 beats that we changed. It turns out they all have something really important in common. First, the last chord in each bar is the applied dominant 7th of the chord that comes next. More specifically, each is an applied 5-4-3, whose bass connects the roots of the surrounding chords by step. Second, Mozart voices each of these chords so that a chromatic tendency tone is in the top voice. In these 2 cases, he has the chordal third, also called the local leading tone, in the top voice, and they need to resolve up by step. So in 5-7 of 6, that's B natural within a G dominant 7th. And in 5-7 of 2, that's E natural within a C dominant 7th. In the middle applied chord, we see the other type of tendency tone, which is a chordal 7th. 5-7 of 4 is an E flat dominant 7th, and the chromatic D flat in the top voice is an altered note that wants to resolve down by step. Now, I can't know this for sure, but I don't think it's a coincidence that Mozart put these tendency tones in the top voice where we are most likely to hear them. They energize the passage in a way that really sets it apart from the Pachelbel style sequence. I'll play both progressions one more time, but now in a steady rhythm, and you can compare them back to back. Here is the Pachelbel. And here's the version with the applied chords. This second progression, the one Mozart actually wrote with the applied chords, that's what we're learning about today. I call it a tonicizing D3 sequence, and it's not something you're going to read about in any textbook, but it's also not particularly rare. Mozart uses them all the time, and we'll see some from young Beethoven as well. Before I start hitting you with bullet points, though, let's finally listen to an actual recording of Mozart's sequence. Okay, so now on to some general points about tonicizing D3s. First, the Mozart passage on screen has exactly 2 chords per model and copy, which is what we've come to expect by now. But actually, tonicizing D3s can and often do have more than that. We'll see models and copies today with 3, 4, 5, or more distinct harmonies. Second, with this kind of sequence, it sometimes feels like the models and the copies overlap. This happens when the model or copy ends with an applied chord that doesn't resolve until the next unit. You probably didn't notice, but when I played the sequence on the piano a minute ago, I didn't stop at the end of the second copy. I went one beat into the next bar. Because this 5-7 of 2 really wants to resolve. You can't just leave it hanging. But we could say the same thing for all the earlier chunks. If you asked me to play just the model, I would always go past the green blob on screen to the next downbeat. So in other words, to my ear, the model isn't really this. No, it's this. But that means that the model technically ends on the same chord that starts the first copy. I don't actually show this in my annotations, so just keep it in mind when we're listening to the examples ahead. Third, because the tonicizing D3 always uses the same applied dominants, we can learn to hear them more effectively by focusing on certain telltale chromatic scale degrees. If you're in major, which these usually are, and you use 5-7 of 6 and then 5-7 of 4, you're going to hear two chromatically altered notes resolving into scale degree 6. First, it'll be scale degree 5 going up. That's the defining note of 5-7 of 6. Then it'll be lowered scale degree 7 going down. That's the sonic fingerprint of 5-7 of 4. So altogether, there is a 5-note chromatic line that will often stick out when we hear this kind of sequence. Here's the key of E flat major just to reorient us. And that chromatic line goes like this. Here it is with Mozart's descending bass. And here it is with all the chords in root position, which gives us a different bass line. Now, this chromatic line won't always be in the top voice like it is in Mozart, but it's a helpful thing to listen for, and I'll try to point it out when I can. Fourth and lastly, because the models and copies encompass larger chunks of music, because they often contain more stuff, more harmonic functions and so on, we sometimes have to make a judgment call about whether the music modulates or not. In other words, we have to decide, based on our hearing, whether a tonicizing D3 sequence really stays in one key, or whether each new copy lays out a new key area. If that seems a bit abstract, you'll see what I mean when we start looking at the examples I've lined up for you, which is right now, actually. This is a transitional theme from Beethoven's first C minor piano sonata, and before we do anything else, I'm just going to play it for you with the main sections labeled. As you listen, I want you to think about the key plan. Despite the 3-flat signature, the excerpt starts in A flat major and then ends in E flat major, so it definitely modulates, but ask yourself whether it visits other key areas along the way. So I can't imagine you had any trouble hearing that the model is copied twice. You might have also noticed that the harmonic rhythm is pretty consistent with exactly one chord per bar throughout. The question, though, is how to understand those chords. The passage clearly starts in A flat major, so we might start by asking where that first key starts to get blurry. The model doesn't waver. It's 5-1 twice in A flat. But then in the first copy, all of the E's are raised to E naturals, which shouldn't surprise us since we're expecting to see raised scale degree 5 as part of 5-7 of 6. So we could, if we wanted, interpret that entire copy as two applied dominants resolving to 6. Now, because this is a sequence, and because we're going down by thirds, we could probably predict by now that the second copy is going to be two instances of 5-7 of 4, which of course it is. And we'd expect lowered scale degree 7 to be in play, which it also is. And then the last 4 bars set up a half cadence in E flat with a backtracking predominant. In this analysis, we've got two key areas that overlap right here at the F dominant that is 5-6-5 of 2 in the first key, but also 5-6-5 of 5 in the second key. But we don't have to hear it this way. Here is a totally different analysis, one that has the model and both of its copies analyzed with the same chords just in a different key each time. So now we're briefly in A flat, then briefly in F minor, then D flat, and finally E flat. Now, I'll admit, I kind of like this analysis a little bit more because it gets rid of weird chords like 5-4-2 of 6-6, or even the 6-6 itself. But what matters is that neither analysis is empirically right or wrong. They're both legitimate ways to hear and think about the same music. If you're drawn to one, you might do well to test the other one out when I play it one more time. So ask yourself, does the 4-key interpretation capture something important? Does it overcomplicate things? Is it maybe both? To my ears, the next two examples sit more clearly in a single key, at least while the sequences last. Here is a passage from the Minuet of Mozart's Symphony No. 40. The model and copies are each 3 bars long, oddly enough, and each one features a single applied chord surrounded by the chord it resolves to. So the model has 2 tonics with 7 diminished in between. The first copy has instances of 6 flanking 7 diminished of 6. And then the last partial copy has 4 chords surrounding 7 diminished of 4. What's interesting is that this process of tonicizing chords that fall by third, 1, then 6, then 4, this continues even after the sequence breaks. The next 2 moves involve 7 diminished of 2, which extend the predominant function as we move toward the half cadential dominant in G minor. Here's a recording of the whole thing. Up next is another early Beethoven excerpt. This one is the slow movement from the first Opus 30 violin sonata, and its model has the highest number of chords we've seen so far, 5 or possibly 6 if we allow for that overlap I talked about earlier. It starts with a basic motion from 1 to 5 and back. After that, we get 2 applied dominants that set up the copy, which starts a third down on the submedian. So the whole model sounds like this. And of course, the copy does the same thing. 6 gets embellished by its own dominant, and then sets up 4 with 2 applied dominants. The thing that sets this sequence apart is that there just is no third copy. When we get to 4, in that second system, the sequence just dissolves. And in those last 4 bars, we get a nice instance of harmony moving on different levels at once. I did a whole video on this back in lesson 22 a few years ago. If we're grazing the surface of the music, there are 10 chords in those 4 bars. But if we zoom out a bit to focus just on the chords that get the strong metrical emphasis, the second system is just a single predominant to dominant motion. And in fact, if we want to zoom out for the duration of the whole excerpt, we end up with a simple, common, and straightforward progression, the 1-6-4-5 that we all know from classical and pop music alike. I talk about that one in video 20. So this is another listening challenge for you. When I play the whole passage, see if you can tune your ears into both levels of harmony at once, by which I mean the slow-moving 1-6-4-5 that's on screen here, and the much faster-moving harmonic progression at the surface. So the last thing I want to show you today is a special kind of tonicizing D3 sequence that my colleagues over in Schema Theory call the Fonte Romanesca. This is another Mozart favorite, and it was named a few years ago by my old friend Vasily Biros of Northwestern University. Like all of our D3 sequences, the Fonte Romanesca is built around a chain of root position triads that descend by third, usually from tonic. So here we are in C major, and our root position downbeats are 1, 6, 4, and 2. We'll call these our pillar chords, and what happens in between them is what defines the Fonte Romanesca. We'll tend to see two things. First, the bass will always walk up into the root position chords with two rising steps, a whole step, then a half step. And those rising steps will always be harmonized with the same two chords, an applied 5-6-5 right before the pillar chord, and then an applied 4-6-5 right before that. So each model and copy is a kind of miniature predominant-dominant tonic progression. Now, as it happens, the progression on screen is taken almost verbatim from the first excerpt I'm going to play for you. The only change we need to make is to add some 9/8 suspensions on each downbeat after the first. Now, I should say that this first excerpt has a lot going on. It's from the Credo of Mozart's Coronation Mass, and it has 4-part counterpoint in the choir, plus extra voices, including a wild runaway violin part in the orchestra. Since the progression is fresh in your ears, you'll probably hear it with no trouble, especially if you follow the bass, which rises by step into each model and copy. I want to wrap up today with one more Fonte Romanesca, also by Mozart. This is from the great D minor piano concerto, and while the texture is much cleaner and easier to follow, the harmony is a bit trickier because the phrase as a whole modulates. It opens in F major, and I want to start by looking at the second system where the bass steps up twice into a root position tonic. That's where the model begins. But we need to notice that the model actually contains 4 chords, not 3. Before he moves down by third, Mozart tucks in a bridging 6 chord. And it's that 4-chord string, including this great unresolved suspension, that gets downshifted by third in the next 2 bars. That's also where the modulation happens. The D minor here that enters as a bridging 6 instantly gets promoted to be the new tonic, since everything that follows is squarely in D minor right up to the PAC at the end of the phrase. So here is the progression of the entire second system. And that's all I'm going to give you before I play the recording. When I do, you've got 2 jobs. One is just to listen carefully for the Fonte Romanesca in the second system. The other is to figure out what I want you to notice in that first system, which I have very deliberately not talked about at all. So pay close attention to the harmony and the phrase design in System 1. What's the key thing here? So first off, I want to clean up the chord symbols in the top system. Each progression in half notes, like this one, is followed up by a faster repetition of basically the same 3 chords. And if we ditch all those little echo progressions, it's much easier to see that the system divides into 3 2-bar ideas. And the 2-bar ideas are all basically the same idea, repeated at different pitch levels. And notice that the change in pitch is consistent. Each unit is a diatonic step higher than the last one. And let's also not miss that it uses weird chords, like 3 in major or 7 diminished 6 of 3/6. What? So let's think about this. Moving in a single direction by a fixed distance, using weird chords along the way, it sounds to me like it might be a sequence. Yep, it's a sequence. And more than that, it's our first rising sequence. So let's listen to that again. Now, you all know how much I like to end my videos with a teaser, so big surprise, I picked this example because it contains a rising step sequence. It's not a very typical one, but it does point us directly at the main topic of video 45, which is up next. I'll meet you there.